There is a before and an after. Not every avoidant reaches it. I want to be honest about that from the start. Some avoidants cycle through the pattern for their entire lives, losing person after person, feeling the loss each time, and never arriving at the place where the feeling becomes the catalyst for something different. But some do, and the ones who do go through something that is genuinely transformative in a way that is unlike any other kind of change I have ever witnessed or experienced. Because it is not change that comes from therapy alone, not change that comes from intellectual understanding of attachment theory or reading the right books or being told the right things by the right people at the right time. It is change that comes from loss. Specific, irreversible, completely real loss of someone who loved them in a way that was genuine and patient and undeserved of what it received. And that kind of loss, when it finally lands at full size, when the defense system has nothing left to soften it with, does something to an avoidant that nothing else can quite replicate. It makes the pattern visible in a way that cannot be unseen. Let me take you through what that change actually looks like. Not in the abstract, in the specific, observable, interior and exterior shifts that happen when an avoidant genuinely arrives at the after. The first change is that the story stops working. Every avoidant carries a story about their pattern. It is not usually a conscious narrative, but it runs underneath everything, providing the frame through which the withdrawals and the distance and the cycle of closeness and retreat get interpreted as something other than what they are. The story sounds like needing space is healthy, like I just was not ready, like we were not compatible in the end, like I gave what I could and it was not enough for them, like some people need more than I am able to give, and that is not a flaw, it is just a fact. Each individual element of the story has enough truth in it to be believable, and as long as the relationships the avoidant loses can be explained by the story survives. But the person who truly loved them, who was patient and real and not asking for anything unreasonable, who was genuinely good and genuinely present and genuinely met the avoidant in every way that was available to them, that person breaks the story. Because the story cannot absorb them, cannot file them under incompatibility or bad timing or needing more than was available. Because what they needed was not extraordinary. What they asked for was not unreasonable. What they offered was not something to be reasonably declined. They just loved the avoidant well, and the avoidant let them go anyway. And when that reality arrives at full size, when the story tries to process it and cannot find a frame that makes it anything other than what it was, the story collapses. And in the collapse of the story, the pattern becomes visible for the first time without its protective narrative. Not as needing space, not as incompatibility, not as a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation, as fear. Old, persistent, structural fear that was never about the other person and was always about something that happened long before they arrived. The second change is that the grief does not follow the usual timeline. Avoidants have a practiced relationship with endings. They have developed, over years of the pattern repeating, a kind of emotional efficiency around loss. The decompression arrives, the relief settles in, the brief, managed sadness passes in its predictable arc, and life resumes its shape with a speed that the people who love them often find both baffling and quietly devastating. But the loss of someone who truly loved them does not follow that arc. It lingers, not dramatically, not in a way that looks from the outside like the avoidant is struggling. The composure is often still present. The self-sufficiency is still visible. The surface holds. But underneath the surface, the grief keeps arriving. In the moments I have described before on this channel, the specific, ordinary moments where the outline of the person appears, the reflex to reach for them that fires before the memory catches up, the Sunday quality of a Sunday that used to contain them. And unlike the usual managed grief that runs its predictable course, this grief does not shorten with time in the expected way, because it is carrying something extra. It is not just the grief of losing the person, it is the grief of finally understanding what was lost, of seeing the relationship clearly, in retrospect and without the distortion of the active defense system, and understanding its actual value, of knowing, with a specificity that is genuinely painful, exactly what was in their hands and what they did with it. That grief is heavier than ordinary grief, and it lasts longer. and in its lasting, it does something that ordinary grief does not do. It teaches. The third change is that their relationship with their own feelings shifts. Before the loss, the avoidant's interior life operates on a principle of management. Feelings are acknowledged enough to be handled and then contained. Vulnerability is monitored and rationed. The interior life is ordered with a tidiness that keeps emotional exposure at a survivable minimum. But after the loss, something in that management system breaks down. Not catastrophically, not in a way that produces crisis or visible collapse, but the efficiency of the containment decreases. Feelings start arriving with more force and more frequency than the system is designed to handle. The management requires more effort and produces less certainty. And in that decreased efficiency, the avoidant begins to encounter their own interior life more directly than they are used to. At first, this feels like something going wrong, like weakness, like a loss of the composure that has always been a source of identity and pride, like the reliable self-sufficiency developing a crack that was not there before. But over time, in the avoidant who is genuinely moving towards the after, something shifts in how they understand what is happening. The feelings that are arriving more forcefully are not evidence of weakness. They are evidence of a self that has been waiting, patiently and for a very long time, to be allowed to exist at full size. And the crack in the composure is not the composure failing. It is the composure revealing itself for what it always was. Not strength, but the imitation of strength that a child builds when they learn that genuine feeling is not safe. And the avoidant, encountering that truth about themselves perhaps for the first time with clarity, begins the work. Not the work of becoming someone different, but the work of becoming more fully who they already are underneath everything they built to stay safe. The fourth change is in how they show up in the next relationship. And I want to be careful here because this is the change that most people reading this are hoping for. The change that makes the avoidant, in the relationship after the one they lost, finally capable of the presence and the consistency and the genuine emotional availability that they could not offer before. That change does happen, but it does not happen automatically from the loss alone. The loss creates the crack. The grief does the initial breaking open. The story collapsing removes the narrative that was maintaining the pattern. But the actual work of change, the building of new responses to old fear, the practice of staying present when the withdrawal reflex fires, the learning of how to tolerate the vulnerability that closeness requires, that has to be chosen deliberately, consistently, against the resistance of a pattern that is deeply embedded and will not simply disappear because the avoidant has finally understood where it came from. The avoidants who make it to the genuine after are not the ones who had the biggest realization. They are the ones who took the realization seriously enough to do something unglamorous and difficult and daily with it. Therapy, honest self-examination, the willingness to be uncomfortable inside closeness instead of escaping the discomfort through distance. The practice of naming what they feel instead of managing it back into containment. The choice, made repeatedly and imperfectly over time, to stay when every part of them wants to go. That is the change. Not a transformation that happens in a single moment of clarity. 1,000 small, daily, unglamorous choices to be different than the pattern recommends. And the person who receives that changed avoidant is not usually the person whose loss produced the change. That is perhaps the hardest truth in all of this. The loss that breaks the pattern open is rarely the relationship that benefits from the breaking. The person who loved them well enough to finally make the pattern visible is usually already gone by the time the avoidant has done enough work to show up the way that person deserved. And that is a grief that belongs to the avoidant alone, to carry, to learn from, to let be the ongoing reminder of what the pattern cost and what the work is for. Not as punishment, as the most honest possible motivation for becoming someone who will not, the next time love arrives that is real and patient and genuinely good, let it go the same way.